Hi, I'm Gary Hoberman. Welcome to another episode of Coffee and Codeless. Now, I gotta say, it's around 6:15 p.m. And if I actually had coffee in this cup, Tim, I wouldn't be sleeping tonight. But so it's actually water, but it's a coffee cup. So at least if you got coffee there, you've got it. So at least one of us does. But welcome again. As I do each time we do these shows, it's bringing the most incredible technology leaders to you and hearing their stories and their journey. And Tim and I first met in our office. You were visiting us from Australia, where you are a chief technology officer at ANZ Bank. And for those who don't know ANZ Bank, it is the bank to look up to in Asia. Like, this is the bank. And so I'm huge credit there. Like, it's amazing. And so when I first met Tim, I'm like, were we split apart at birth or something like that? Because what we were saying was the exact same. And then when I got to visit Tim recently in my 2-day trip to Sydney and Melbourne, and 5 days of travel, of course, for that, and of Tim made time to meet, it was just continuation of like old friends that have climbed this corporate ladder in banking in a past life. And so Tim, tell us who you are. Give us your background. Tell us what your role is within ANZ.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Yeah, so my name, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at ANZ Bank. Chief Technology Officers in our region essentially look after strategy, architecture, and engineering standards. So I help set we try and work out what we're going to do with technology, which technologies we're going to back, which technologies we're going to exit, and then sort of try and govern the fairly material amount of investment we make each year with the very large and extended technology team. Thousands of people working inside of ANZ that are predominantly delivering, value for our customers and meeting all of our obligations to our regulators. We preside over a large, complex estate. We operate in something like 30 markets, but we have the bulk of our operations anchored in both Melbourne and in Wellington in New Zealand, and the bulk of our markets tend to be in the Australian and New Zealand markets, hence the name.
How many customers? I'm just curious, from those 30 markets.
We count about 8.8 million, which, in the US market, wow, that might sound small, but it essentially, we're the largest bank in New Zealand. We own about 30% of the market there. There's 4 major banks in Australia, and we're sort of probably about 15% of the market share there in most of the retail factors. We're a pretty big, though, institutional bank, and that's our business that spreads across most of Asia. We've got offices and businesses in many Asian countries.
That's amazing, and that is 8 million plus customers is definitely not small. And it's amazing. And the role of CTO, we were chatting before, like this, the title CTO has many different meanings in different countries, and so you have architecture, you've got the standards, you have I'm assuming your buy, hold, sell charts, which says, here's what we're buying and investing in, here's what we're exiting, here's the red, yellow, greens, if I remember them right. Or I'd love to hear your thought process around that.
Yeah, so we've got, organizations like ours have had a long time, a long history of technology. Like, we've got technology in our bank that is, some of our systems that we have in the bank are older than the average staff member's age, right? Not my age, but and so that's inevitable. And sometimes we call them legacy. Legacy used to be a good word. But we essentially have a lot of robust technologies but they are of differing ages. And proliferation of technology has, we've seen an explosion of technology ever since the advent of the internet. Before the internet, technology teams represented something like less than 2% of the bank. It's now much closer to more than 20%. But the proliferation of technology and the urgency to get to market has obviously then means it's very easy to create new technology. It becomes harder to manage it. And so I have the sometimes unenviable job of trying to work out how we can make harder decisions and not always get additional new technologies into our environment, but judiciously choose which ones we can collapse. And this is always obviously really, really complicated because there's an urgency to get to market with new things, but the obligations of maintaining existing things is hard. And you end up with a lot of diseconomies of scale when you end up with so many little things. And so we've got a strategy where we're trying to converge more things onto common platforms and say, look, the benefit of having commonality exceeds the benefit of having speciality in some cases, right? And so that, otherwise you end up with, 5 different video conferencing systems, 7 different source control systems. And what's, the value there for the team ends up with, collective mediocrity if you're not careful, because the individual pools of speciality are not significant enough.
Collective mediocrity. I am going to get a T-shirt made with that. And Tim, this is what, like, it's amazing, because like when you're an engineer and you're asked to build something, there's an excitement to build it. And absolutely, I could see like Copilot and AWS Whisper and Google's tool sets all helping you write the code faster. But it's once you move to your position, you see the cost and you see the legacy and you see what's been built. And it's I had lunch with a CFO today who was one of the large CFOs in a bank, and when I was telling him what we do and what our goals are, and he looked at me and goes, tech reported to me, and he's like, I felt like I was the only one in the company that really cared about the after it was built. Like everyone else was just excited to build something new and get it done, and he's the one sweating bullets of like, I gotta keep paying for this. It's amazing.
And software has a degree of longevity that's often underestimated, and the complexity of managing its longevity is often underestimated. So it's quick to dismiss older technology as poor or out of date, but very often it's actually written extremely well, but it doesn't attract as much attention to maintain. And people don't often think about, well, this piece of code that I've written is actually going to be in the bank for 20 years, and I plan not to be in the bank for 20 years. And so the ability to manage, own, operate, change it, make it, add some flex to it, it's more complicated than just documenting your code with comments, right? The actual longevity of the system involves, it's not going to be me that maintains the code I write, and making sure that you actually have that longevity, you understand the cost of this. And we're trying to shift away from this model where we think of every single technology as just a small piece of asset, and think of the cohesion of them as a service. And we really need a much greater level of transparency of what goes into a service, and what the level of transparency of what the mechanics are of that. So you can understand, and when I say mechanics, the cost of a piece of technology, the reliability of a piece of technology, the changeability of the codependencies. But if you don't have a plan and you think of these as just individual pieces, they get thrown in, and you end up with what's often called the big ball of mud. You end up with that sort of collective set of systems that are very quickly, don't touch it, it ain't broke. And unfortunately, that then, that starts to chew up more of your budget. And you end up basically having to say, well, I have to spend all this money managing the risk of systems. And so, when you get these opportunities, which we do have right now, to reinvent and coalesce some of the older systems into newer ones, designing them for longevity, and longevity of confidence of how you can change them. And we've got a pretty material investment right now in a new go-to-market offering, which we call ANZ Plus. That's sort of forward-looking to think about how we're going to manage that longer term. Some of that code's already several years old, and it's going to live for a very, very long time. So managing that for longevity is pretty important.
There's so few technologists that think the way you're saying it, Tim. I gotta say, most people just say, finish line is it launches and we hit the dates and it's within budgets, various whatever budgets, and on time, and no one thinks about like that it's going to keep a life. And it reminds me, even worse than banking. So I went from banking to insurance, and in insurance, your product processor in a bank is called a policy admin system in an insurance company, and that's the equivalent. And the problem is, like, you code a product, like every single, like with new life insurance in Australia, we're launching a brand new product and regulations, and it's all code, and it takes like 9 months to a year before you actually finish and test and deploy. And then if you sell a single policy, you have to keep that system alive, that code alive, until that person passes away. It's life insurance. It's like, so it's an 80-year, maybe, hopefully for the person, it's 100-year or 200-year. But and I remember when cost reduction was happening and the business was like pointing at IT and going, hey, Gary, you take out the $1 billion in costs. And I went back and I said, can we stop creating products that we only sell once or twice, if that's the case? That's what, yeah.
We have a requirement in our region to hold customer data for the life of the commercial relationship plus 7 years. And mortgages in Australia
Plus 7
typically
years.
plus 7 years. So mortgages in Australia are typically 25 years. So if you're building a mortgage process, you might need to investigate it and replay what was happening during the application process 32 years from now. Right now, that kind of responsibility in banking is similar to the one in insurance. These products are not features; they're not an acquisition like a book off a bookstore that once you've done the deal, it's done. These financial products are active, living products, and so that's why I work in banking. It's one of the more interesting divisions or industries, I think, because every time you're doing major system change, you're effectively doing heart surgery on someone while they're jogging. You can't slow down. You can't stop the bank at 3 a.m. Someone's credit card still has to work, right? It has to be on all of the time, and balancing that need for always on with the need to be very adaptable is probably one of the more interesting kind of architectural problems. That's what I think is fascinating. It's really complicated.
I love it.
We've got to balance that tension, and we've got to do that inside of a pretty significant responsibility to the customer that is very material in terms of managing their money and keeping their trust.
That's amazing. Tim, give me your story, how you got to CTO. Like, so your journey up to that point and your engineer background, what did you start coding in if you did? Like, what's the background there?
Yeah, so I was one of the cowboys of the early internet era, just hacking through how you actually would build websites. At the time, all of the proper programmers were saying, no, you couldn't do that. You got to build it in C++. And I didn't know anything about that. So everything we did was just basic scripting, like just garbage, really simplistic stuff.
Was it Perl, CGI Perl at that point?
No, we didn't go there. We were using I was working actually at Microsoft at the time, or a company that worked for Microsoft. And I can't remember the name of the technology, but we only had if statements. It was incredibly simplistic stuff. And it was like, if this, then show this content, otherwise show this content. And it was pretty trivial. And then suddenly we worked out how to hook up databases and actually present results on screens. And so suddenly the penny drops and you go, yeah, everything's going to move like this. I went through the process of then working in a startup. We used to call them .com. But that whole era where we're building websites and just frantically for all of the blue chip companies. And you suddenly then started to realize problems of scale. What do you do when you need more than one server and you need to maintain state across server? And that's when I got interested in and drawn into architecture, where you have to design more complex systems. You have to worry about fault tolerance. You have to worry about, a lot more. We were pretty cavalier in the early days around security, and you get to learn about security. And then I got drawn into banking because banks, particularly here, we have very significant investments in technology, and there were large teams building large capabilities as banks left the era of bricks, started moving to this, everything online. And banks in Australia, the only, if you take out the social media platforms from North America, the only application in Australia that gets more user activity daily is the weather page. All of the banks get probably every time I click your fingers, that's another 50 customers who just logged in to our website, right? So it's just constant. And these problems of scale, right? Like it's 50 a second. They're just continually logging in, checking something, checking a balance. And this scale has been increasing. The first websites we built in Australia were a curiosity in the 90s. By the early 2000s, 1 million people were using them. By the end of 2010, you're getting regularly 3 to 4 million people a day, right? And we've got a very digitally savvy population in Australia and New Zealand. We've got a very high density of broadband for a very long period of time, and we've had internet-based payments available overnights for free since about 1997, right? Because of the banks, there's only 4 banks. They used to be heavily regulated, so real-time payments and has been a reality in Australia for a very long time. And so people are quite savvy around this. And so our population moved there quickly. But then the reason I joined the bank scare is just the technology investment and the scale of what we're trying to achieve was just really interesting, because you suddenly do how on earth do you basically make sure 50 people logging on a second don't have any interruption of service? And you're dealing with this with every known technology under the sun, because you've had 40 years of investing in technology. So you've got part of that equation is back in the mainframe. There's something pulling data out of something that's using COBOL. very reliable, very predictable, very useful. And then across the top, you've got layers and layers of different technology that have come before you. So I've been in banking for a while. I had a brief foray when looking at an innovation agenda for a bank in Canada. But after a while, I came back to Australia and joined ANZ, and we were rebuilding the architecture practice here. And after a while, it became a little bit more apparent that we probably needed a permanent voice to not just talk about architecture, but also talk about engineering and then talk about strategy. So that's been my path. A little bit of a software development background, a lot of architecture, and then a lot of talking to people around how you make the right kind of decisions when you've got a complex ecosystem.
I love when you talk architecture and you said the word services before, and everyone thinks microservices and that stuff. Then microservices in many ways, if done incorrectly, could make the company worse. It could make it more complex and difficult but you're thinking services in terms of like common architecture features of a business and then common design of those services so that it's reusable. You do it once, you think through it once, you don't have to do it 100 times. Is that kind of what, just make sure level set when you said so, because it's really cool what you described as commonality.
If we think about the process of helping you open an account, Gary, right?
Yep.
If you want to open an account with ANZ, you can't because you're in New York. But if you were in Australia and you wanted to open an account, we have a lot of systems that need to participate in that. We're going to have to do one system that checks your identity, right? Make sure that we gather all your customer details.
Yeah, no KYC, also, right? Check
KYC, and then we're going to check you're not actually an internationally wanted criminal. So we've got a bunch of those checks, and that's a different system. And then we've got to basically collect all of your documents, and we've got to basically hold document evidence that you are who you are, right? We then have to interact with a system that creates an account, right? We have to create the account. We have to then, create you as an owner of that account and fund the account. And then we have to start generating statements. Now, each of those components together are treated like they're often different technologies and different systems because they work with other things. But the collective of those really performs the service called open account. And what we really want to know is what is the total cost of actually opening an account and what's the interdependencies between those? And if something breaks, what's the actual impact? You'll have marketing systems that get involved in that make sure that we understand the attribution of where your original click came from. We've got websites. Stitching that all together and treating it as a service then says, actually, we've got different parts of the bank that open accounts, whether it be a deposit account, be it a credit account, etc. Which parts of this service can actually be adaptable, and what's the actual minimum expectations of the service of both the consumer who actually consumes it and the service that provides it. And that kind of mindset is a shift in thinking for us to start trying to think about the collective as opposed to the individual parts. And it's language we're trying to use because we've had it's possibly even described better as a business architecture, Gary, because it's about trying to say, how do you design an organization?
Yeah, it's customer journeys, journey mapping, and then going through the business. I love the word business architecture. And most people don't know what that means, but that's what you're describing. I remember I think it was Citi. It's been a long time, but it was about $12,000 it cost to do a mortgage, to open a mortgage. And it's when you think about that cost and the process and what it was, and then and what was crazy was, Tim, I remember I was the one raising these issues because I remember going through the process of mortgage as an employee, and it's like, I'm of course going to use Citi. I'm an employee. And the first step is like, that's great. Fax your, pay stubs to this, Tampa fax machine over here. And again, I was like, I'm an employee. Like, you could pull them like I can from the system. It's like just I don't really want to print on a public printer and then fax to a fax machine my pay stubs that sensitive. And it's funny when you think about the costs, and the business architecture term is great. I mean, if everyone did that, like just step back and said, let's think about the process where we should be, not jump into coding, which is where everyone jumps to, we have to build something. Let's just build it.
Yeah, we've got a very disciplined team in a product a platform we're taking to market called ANZ Plus, that is reimagining that end-to-end mortgage process. And instead of just starting with trying to work out what the tech is that they're going to build, they've actually gone through the discipline of mapping the end-to-end capabilities, what you actually need, what's the steps in the process, and why things are broken, or not broken, probably the wrong term. Where are those sort of friction points in a traditional mortgage process? And so that's a tremendously patient and purposeful approach to this. And I think we need more of that. And that's how you're going to get that better end-to-end experience.
I like it. I like it. And Tim, we can't do anything these days without Gen AI. Like, so it seems like everything we do, like I'm actually not here. It's just, this is my deep fake. And you know, but like, it's amazing. So I know you've also been in the news talking about what you're doing with AI and practical. It seems very practical within customer engagement. How do you view, like, what, I'm curious what you're doing already, and then where do you think that could go? Where's the possibility?
Yeah. So we've used, I mean, this term, we do need a better lexicon to describe AI because it's just an amorphous technology. We've been using machine learning techniques for maybe a decade. We use it in the kind of statistical models that we build to sort of model credit risk. We use the same kind of base mathematics there. We've used it to start to break into some of our products. Analyzing sentiment analysis from social media is often used. Machine learning and AI. We've got AI in when you sign up for a bank account in ANZ Plus, you take a selfie, compare that to your driver's license, and we do use AI there to make sure you're taking a picture of a real human, a live human, so that we can cut down on fraud risk. So we use those technologies for a while, but of course everything changed in December 22, right? And you suddenly realize that a lot of the machine learning that is intuitively going to change the world, we saw how when it's applied to language, you suddenly realize so many things are going to change, whether it be the way we write and review code and the way we actually generate tests. But also so much work with what we do inside of banking is very much about, and it's going to trivialize it, but it's translation. It's moving from one format document to another. Sometimes it's from a spec to code, right? Sometimes if we think about business, is this loan application compliant with this policy? Or is this procedure we have compliant with this regulation? And today we use, really ineffective processes of debating this in meetings, whereas there's a whole lot of technologies now you can use with generative AI. Say, highlight the differences between these documents, or help me draft a proposal and make sure it complies with this standard. And so that's the kind of opportunities we're kind of exploring right now. We're nowhere near ready to think about this for the customers because we're a bank, we've got an awesome responsibility. We're not ready to start applying this for customer use cases. We want to move purposefully around just making sure we understand the tech. And it's very easy to get fooled, very easy to get fooled by some of the almost prescient answers you get that if you just double check them, they're probably not answers, they're just generated phrases that look plausible. And so you need to be very cautious. And we've found some really amazing capabilities when we take some of these large language models, look at some of our documents and ask questions, which, like we did this with a subset of documents internally, and said, you ask a question around a particular procedure one. Normally you would have to scan through 80 of those documents and try and find the answer. It can help you discover the answer and point to the document where it got the answer from. So when you get these really narrow use cases, you suddenly realize that, wow, you could probably transform a lot of activity that we do today and make it fundamentally better. So we're pretty excited about a couple of different use cases around searching for documents, drafting documents, and also helping people, obviously in the software engineering space, make that whole process much, much more seamless than it is today. But still early days. This is going to transform a lot of things, but every now and then you sort of come up with these really thorny questions around what happens if this happens. And I don't know the answers to all these questions. I just know it's a super exciting time to be a CTO.
It is, absolutely. And I think hallucinations, I mean, we haven't used the word hallucination so much in my entire life than we've been using it the past 6 months. And it's interesting because to me, like, hallucinations is like, it's the technology basically, it's picturing 60,000 people all learning independently. And when someone learns something, they teach the next 59,999. And we don't work like that. Like, it's kind of funny. So like, I always think, like, if there were 6 doctors graduating medical school, imagine their collective knowledge was combined together every time they shared and learned something, like how much faster they would become better with patients. We wouldn't call them hallucinations, but it's kind of what we're seeing there, which is fascinating. It's that to me is a fascinating aspect.
I mean, the hallucinations is hysterical as a phrase. It's quite funny because the idea of a computer that's just been fed magic mushrooms is kind of interesting. But the whole basis of this, which I thought was fascinating, was this that the word prediction, if it always uses the most likely word in the next sentence, then inevitably what you're going to see is really boring content. And if you you take the temperature and you tune the temperature in these models down to zero, it's boring as all hell, right? You turn the temperature up to the maximum, it becomes indecipherable within one or two sentences, right? It's not even English, right? And so the fact that a degree of randomness is well, it's essentially how we talk, right? We're plucking from our brains synonyms and choosing not always the most common synonym because we've just used it before. But it's very anxiety-inducing when you work in an industry like mine, where precision is inferred, right? That there is no,
Yes.
that it's repeatable, it's defendable, and it's reliable. And of course, that's not 100% of banking, because people in sales, they will use language to persuade someone. They will, the way we have conversations are, of course, very human. But systemizing that now into a computer is going to cause a degree of discomfort. All right, and we've got to work out where we accept some of that discomfort and where we don't. And you sit there and go, look, if I'm writing documents or articles for our internal teams describing, Christmas holidays and what we're going to do with, simple stuff, you go, yeah, it's okay if you have a little freedom and flexibility there. But if you probably don't want a highly creative description of a policy around standards around bribery and corruption, you've got to have very prescriptive language.
Yeah.
But if you dig into the details and realize that when you take these models that are very broad corpuses of the human knowledge base and zero them in on narrow functions, a lot of these problems become really, really niche. They don't become particularly common. We use a general LLM, and we ask one of the ones we've got, we ask it, and it's definitely on hallucinogens, because the way it comes up with answers, we've got a couple of ones, and it just always cracks everyone up when you ask it a basic question around some of the people and like some public figures that it should know better. But as soon as you take that exact same model and narrow its scope to just a very specific data set of some public documents on ANZ's website, it becomes extremely, extremely accurate. And so I think that's the exciting thing for me, is as we learn as an industry how we can actually make the whole banking ecosystem stronger, this is going to be a tremendous boon for so many fields. I think it's really important that we get going on this. I think it's the most exciting time we've had. It's the biggest innovation in 30 years.
I completely agree. I mean, to me, like we had on the CEO of IGAN, which is a specifically financial service document OCR / Gen AI company, and we're partnering with them in many customers where you see how they could break a financial or legal contract down to meaning. Amazing. I've never seen anything like it before, and just digest it. And then you look at the general purpose OCRs that are out there and you say, like, okay, I get what they do, but when you can actually use Gen AI to do something niche, like you're saying, it's a niche. It's basically very focused, very trained. It'd be interesting, Tim, like in the banking world, what I noticed about banking was like banks understand consortiums and sharing, and they have to do Swift and ACH and payments. And like in insurance, when I entered that insurance world, it was very much about isolation and like we're on our own, and there's no standards, there's no data exchange, there's no, like, if you in the US, as crazy as it sounds, if in the US you applied for insurance and you said you already have a policy with another company, the new company is required to phone call the old company and say, hey, by the way, just, Tim has insurance. Let me verify what he has. Okay, please put in a cancellation date manually for this date when we activate the new one. And it's all manual. There's no, so like it'll be interesting to see if AI will also encourage data sharing in industries where they've been isolated, like insurance. Hope the answer is yes, because that would be a game changer in that space.
So, we've got, I mean, the privacy and the privacy rules around sharing data are even more relevant in an AI world. And we've got really strict privacy policies that aren't just things that we need to comply with, they're also things we want to comply with, right? Because that just makes sense. Privacy is a fundamental aspect of banking. We do have in Australia the open banking framework, which is the way how people permit other companies to pass their data from one company to the other. And that adoption has been relatively sluggish, but that's the preferred mechanism, and that's probably where we'll move things around. And I think you'll see that. I do think, though, that when you are trying to exchange data between two systems, and today the interface is what I would refer to as a human one, but one that is procedural in nature, as in, when
Yes.
the person who's answering the telephone call or interacting with you is essentially the interface. That's not the person is not necessarily adding additional analytical value or rules checking. They're literally just transposing your conversation into a system. Right? There are all sorts of industries where people are essentially taking what you want and then typing it into a computer. And if that person is not, there's obviously other things that many people do, which is about the relationship. But when it is purely a transactional function, you can see that the way to interface with those will quickly, you can take generative AI and turn it around and essentially turn intent into a system record. And I think that's going to be pretty exciting, where we've actually got a whole lot of, relatively lower value activities, which is just transposition or translation. Translation from one format into another, from a conversation into a form. And I think you'll see a lot of generative AI making those forms much, much easier to actually fill them in with less human effort on both the person making the request and the person facilitating the request. And you look at that across all sorts of industries, there's going to be a ton of improvement there. In the example where someone's doing that as well as managing the relationship, I think it just means that they're much more augmented human who can concentrate on the relationship, and data transmission is made much easier for them.
I love it. I think it's an amazing vision, Tim. That's so Tim, last minute, we went right up to 30 minutes here. So this went by like that. I can't believe it. But last piece of advice, favorite book, favorite thing. What do you think you would tell someone coming and joining you? What's anything you would share just with the audience? I'd love to get one thing that you would say is, yeah.
All right, you broke up there just a little bit, Gary. Can you just ask that question one more time?
Sorry, Tim. I'm sorry. I was saying, is there one last piece of advice you would give our audience? Anything that you've learned along your career, amazing career?
I think it's the one message that we have, and we've got a lot of people here like this, is that the people who generally love working in technology love the novelty of technology. And there's always a risk that one then, as a human, we tend to want to resist change. And there's this weird thing where people enter technology, learn it, and then become recalcitrant about other new technology, right? And some of the coolest innovators back in the 70s were the people who were building mainframes. And then they went, why are we doing these things called PCs? And then the people who were doing really cool stuff with 3-tier architecture went, what's this thing called the web? No. So I think the most important attribute we have in our industry is curiosity. And that curiosity needs to be both at the individual and industrialized level within teams. Right? Curiosity is what is going to lead to, first of all, the appetite to innovate. Curiosity, how does it work? Why does it work that way? What else can we do? Curiosity is probably the most valuable thing I think I've had in my career, was an interest in what's the next thing. Now, this does not mean following fads. Curiosity also means, well, how does it actually work? And I think if you understand how things work and you spend the time asking questions, and I ask I've gotten a long way in my career just by not being afraid to ask questions around how does it work. And 1 in 10 times I sound a bit stupid because I should know the answer to something, maybe 1 in 20, but that then just helps me learn something more. So understanding how it works, not treating things as a black box, and AI is not that complicated to read about. There's a lot of material out there. And understanding how it works, why it works, and then thinking through the implications. Curiosity, most valuable skill ever.
I completely love it. Curiosity, and reminds me, I remember there was a CEO I had met, and he had said he's moving to the cloud. I'm like, well, why are you moving the systems to the cloud? They were like .NET systems, and what do you? And he goes, oh, because my board said we need more data. Like, And I was like, well, like it's just you could be a little more curious there to say, what's the benefit of moving to the cloud, and will I get more data? Is it more secure? And it's asking those questions is what I completely agree. And so thank you for that advice, Tim. I really appreciate you joining me on the show here. And you could finish your cup of coffee. I'm going to finish my cup of water. And this way I'll sleep tonight. And I really appreciate you and your vision and sharing with everyone. Thank you again for coming on. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for hosting me, Gary. Cheers.
Thank you, Tim. Take care. Bye.